Alrighty, welcome back, everyone. We just talked about a docu-series possibly coming to Netflix around the SEC this upcoming year, and it would be a wild one to watch, that's for sure. Tons of very, very, very good talking points going into this season for the SEC, and I would absolutely be watching, that's for sure. But let's get into a Hot Take Thursday, and mine is the Big 12 champion will have at least 2 losses going into that game. Let's say coming out of that game. Let's just be... Well, I guess going into that game would be coming out of that game, but that's beside the point. The Big 12, in my opinion, is the most interesting conference in the entire country. I think between the new teams coming in, some of the quarterbacks that are going to be, really dominating that conference this upcoming year, but also just every single team feels like they have a shot. Now, not every team, but 10 of the 16 teams are plus 1,800 or better to win the conference. You have to go all the way down to Colorado to see a steep drop-off from West Virginia at 1,800. I believe it's Colorado at plus 4,000. So, obviously, a huge difference between those two, and it gives you an idea of what this conference is all about. There is not a team that is outright, bar anything better than everyone else. Utah is the team that kind of separates themselves from the pack, but even then, they have a lot of games on their schedule that could trip them up, especially in a conference that they haven't played in before. So I think it's going to be fascinating to watch. It's one of those things that whenever you can get a great season out of a conference that might not get as much love as some of the others, it's always a great thing. We saw it with the Pac-12 a year ago, where a lot of people, were focusing on the SEC and the Big Ten and all of that jazz, but the Pac-12 came out and had probably the best year it's had in quite some time, maybe ever. So it's going to be incredible to watch. I think this conference might just be the one that if you got nothing to do, or if there's nothing on late on a Saturday, or if you're just looking for a good game to watch, tune into a Big 12 game, and somehow you're going to get a close game. I can almost promise you that. Now, a lot of this does have to do with some of the out-of-conference games that these teams are going to be playing. There are not easy schedules across the Big 12 in conference, but out of conference you have Kansas State's got to play at Tulane, and they have Arizona out of conference for some reason. I guess it was scheduled before they joined the conference and didn't want to necessarily change that up. So that's a very interesting one. Obviously, I think both those teams are pretty happy that's not a conference game because it doesn't affect their chances to make the conference title game, but it will still give us a really good idea of what this conference looks like in 2024. Utah plays Baylor out of conference, so that's another one that's really weird, but definitely will be a very, very interesting one to watch there. Oklahoma State plays Arkansas, Kansas plays Illinois and UNLV, Iowa State always gets Iowa. So there's not a lot of easy out-of-conference games for these teams. Now, likely the majority of those games should be won by the Big 12 team, but it's not a layup by any means. That Oklahoma State-Arkansas game is one I'm watching very closely because at face value, at least from where I'm standing, Oklahoma State is the better team. They have a lot of veteran leadership. They have the quarterback coming back. They have a lot of really good things over there, while Arkansas has not so many steady things over there, although I think Taven Green's going to be absolutely incredible this upcoming year. But it's one of those games that I think is going to be fascinating to watch, and I think will give you an idea of what's the gap between these two conferences. If Arkansas walks into Stillwater and beats Oklahoma State, it's going to be a weird conversation. Let's put it that way. People are going to, really, really go into the SEC is so much far ahead of these rest of these conferences, and you might as well break off. And there will be some bad conversations happening. Let's just put it that way. But then when you get into the conference schedule, it doesn't get much easier. This conference is going to be really hardly fought, and there's a number of teams that might not, make it to Arlington, might not be the team that wins the entire thing, but they could be the thorn in the side of some teams that really want to win the entire thing. I think the two that I'm looking at really closely are Texas Tech and TCU. Both these teams technically have a shot to win the title, and I think Texas Tech is a very, very interesting one to watch, frankly. But both those teams could absolutely beat anyone in the conference. There's not a team in this conference that is entirely going to outweigh that team where you can just walk in and pen in a win and just move forward on your day. So I think Texas Tech and TCU are going to be hard matchups no matter where you get them. And a lot of teams get them, at Texas Tech or at TCU, which is not ideal by any means. And then you have Colorado and UCF, two teams that are on the outside looking in, have a very, very hard path to get to a conference title and possibly win it, although Dion has promised that for Colorado for some reason. But they're going to be teams that are going to be hard outs, and they're going to be teams that are going to make it life not easy on you. UCF is one of those teams where if you have to travel to Central Florida to play that team, there's a chance that they beat you. I know Utah has to do it at some point in the season, and that one's a little bit worrisome. I think if you're watching any game in the Utah season as one that could trip them up, that might be the one. And then Colorado has every chance to use that ability, play a really, really good game, and possibly knock off one of these teams. And then you get into kind of the teams that could make this prediction entirely incorrect. And I think you start with Utah. That's probably the easiest path to make this prediction not true, because they don't necessarily have the most aggressive out-of-conference schedule. They don't necessarily play the big-time teams. Now, at Baylor is not going to be an easy game by any means, but they should win that and keep it moving. But I think it's going to be a very, very fascinating thing to watch, and there's still games on that schedule that are really worrisome. They invite Arizona into Utah during the year. They go to Oklahoma State, which is an atmosphere that a lot of people are not prepared for when they walk in. Let's just put it that way. If that's a night game, then Utah has their work cut out for them, because for some reason it just gets a little bit darker in Stillwater around that time of year. But that's besides the point. Kansas State, is another team to watch that could separate itself from the pack. The out of conference being at Tulane, at Colorado, or having at Tulane out of conference, and then going to Colorado, Iowa State, more teams in the conference. It's not going to be easy. There's going to be teams that trip them up, and Kansas State is a team that has, two remarkable playmakers and has a really good foundation around it, but it's not necessarily going to just outright overpower teams or outright out-talent teams throughout this schedule. So that's going to be fascinating to watch. I think the Big 12, from where I'm standing, is not only the most interesting, not only the most tightly fought, but the most confusing conference in the entire country. I think where I'm leaning right now is Utah will likely win this conference, but there's like 4 different teams that I'm rotating in and out of Arlington right now, and there might just be 5 by the end of the offseason. So it's not an easy conference to pin down, and I think that lends itself to a little bit of chaos, kind of like what we saw last year, really. Texas was the only one that kind of curbed a lot of the worries that a lot of the other teams had, or a lot of the hurdles that a lot of the teams got tripped up on. Texas was barely able to clear. That Houston game was fairly sketchy. The TCU game, the exact same. So there's some of these games that definitely tripped up teams a year ago, and I think this year it's only going to get more tightly fought. I think these teams are only getting closer and closer together in terms of talent. I think Utah is the team that I would separate from the pack just a little bit, but everyone else, there's about 6 or 7 teams right there that are going to be in the same realm, that are going to be fighting for kind of the same spot. So when you talk about Kansas State, Kansas, Arizona, Oklahoma State, those are teams that absolutely could make a run and be a team that maybe goes 11-1, maybe makes the conference title game and wins that and goes to the playoff. But then there's also Colorado, Houston, West Virginia, UCF that maybe won't make that big time run, but they could ruin the run for someone else. So it's a very fascinating conference. I think there's going to be so many different things that go into this, but also one of the big things that I kind of want to touch on shortly here is, what if this does happen? What if we do have a 2-loss conference champion going into that week, and you have, say, 2 10-2 teams walking into Arlington, a better hypothetical here. Let's say you have 1-11 team, a 11-1 Utah against a 10-2 Kansas State. Let's just put that out there, and Kansas State wins that game. Are we confident that Utah would get in? Because I understand they went to their conference title game. I know that they would be 11-2. I know that they would have good wins over Tulane and some other teams on their schedule, or not Tulane, but they would have some really good wins on their schedule. The reality is, I don't know if that outweighs a 3-loss or even a 4-loss SEC or Big Ten team, if I'm being totally honest. And maybe it should. I think there's a real reality where Utah might be the better team, but when you look at, say, a 3-loss Ole Miss team this year, if they lose to, Georgia and Alabama and LSU, I don't know if I can make the argument that 11-2 Utah team is outright better than the 9-3 Ole Miss team. So it's going to be a fascinating thing to watch. I think someone's going to have to separate themselves, and maybe two teams will have to separate themselves if they want a multi-bid league, because that's going to be a really, really sketchy proposition in this league this upcoming year. I think it's going to be an absolute fight, and I think there's not going to be a lot of games where you can just pen in a win, you can just move on and feel very confident going into that game, because not only, are these teams so packed together, but a lot of the teams are different than what you faced in the past. Utah's never faced UCF. They haven't faced Oklahoma State at Oklahoma State. So there's some of these games that are going to trip them up that we might not expect. So I absolutely love this conference. I'll be totally honest with you. It's my favorite conference in the entire country going into this year because of this, because I think it's going to be so weird, because I think it's going to be off the walls, and I think there's going to be no team that comes out unscathed. So I cannot wait for this, season to kick off, for these teams to start to really get into this fight. And once they do, I think it's going to be a little bit of a bloodbath. It'll be really, really fun to watch, and definitely be one that we'll have to be watching down to the very, very last week. But that'll do it for this edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Your support means a lot to us, so please remember to subscribe to the show, leave a positive review. It does make a huge difference for us. Also, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, all of the social pages for every content and update you could possibly need in the world of sports. We have incredible people doing work across every single sport you could think of. So if you need anything, come on over to GSMC and we have you totally covered. But thank you once again for listening, and I will see you guys tomorrow.